Hi and welcome to our next instalment of the History GCSE revision. I'm sorry about the break there in the clips. I've just been away on holiday. So we're going to keep going with Elizabethan England, and this week we're going to be looking at Mary Queen of Scots. So let's rock on and do this. So remember, here are our sections. So we're going to move on away from religion and actually onto challenges that Elizabeth faced at home and abroad. And in this section, Mary Queen of Scots. So let's remind ourselves of the questions. In this particular week, we'll focus on the explain why question. So if you want to have a go doing this question, give it to me, I'll mark it. So explain why Mary Queen of Scots posed a significant threat to Elizabeth's position as Queen. So on the surface, this is quite a complicated question, but actually it's relatively straightforward, and I've tried to keep it simple and so you get the main points. So first of all, let's just remind ourselves about who Mary Queen of Scots was and why she was such a threat to Elizabeth. So first of all, she was a great-granddaughter of Henry VIII. So I'm not very good at this kind of thing with families, but basically the sister of, no, sorry, the brother of Henry VIII, the younger brother of Henry VIII had children, and basically further down the line, Mary Queen of Scots was born. Now, she was Catholic and had married Francis I, the French king. So that created a problem because obviously Elizabeth was Protestant and France was a rich and powerful country, and her husband was also rich and powerful. So why is she important is because she had a very strong legitimate claim to the throne. Just remind yourselves that many people questioned Elizabeth's claim to the throne because her mother was Anne Boleyn, who many people believed was not the rightful uh, wife of Henry VIII. So they believed that she had a stronger claim. So this encouraged plots. And to make things even worse for Elizabeth, she had a son, James, who later became James I. And obviously Elizabeth didn't have children. So this created a big problem. Now, what made it even worse was she was living in, she moved back to Scotland. Her French husband died. She's pretty unfortunate, actually, with her husbands and men in general. And basically, she was married to this guy, Lord Darnley, who's a Scottish lord, who's the father of James I. And she was accused of murdering her husband. And he died in some bizarre fire. And she then, pretty much immediately after Darnley died, married another guy called the Earl of Bothwell. The Scottish lords were totally incensed by this and felt she basically killed her own husband, and effectively forced her to abdicate the throne. She moved to England, where Elizabeth quite sensibly placed her under armed guard. So let's just look at the options that Mary had, or problems she caused for Elizabeth, and what could Elizabeth do about it. So first of all, could she help Mary regain the throne? So if she did that and sent her back to Scotland with English support, this would anger the Scottish, and inevitably they would unite with the French and cause problems for Elizabeth. So that wasn't really an option. She could give Mary over to the Scottish lords, but who probably in more likelihood would execute her. But basically that would be executing the former wife of the French king, which could start a war with the French. She could let her leave England and go abroad, but obviously her most likely country would be France, who would be encouraged to start an invasion against England. So the option she went with was number 4, was to keep Mary in England. Now it was a kind of a best of a bad choice, because the problem with that was it encouraged Catholic plots in England. She could have, and many people advised her to do this, was to make Mary her heir, and obviously therefore would kind of close this question down of legitimacy and all that kind of thing. But the Privy Council, who are made up of Protestants, would not agree to this, quite rightly because they believed it would lead to another or a civil war in England. So quite a complicated slide that. So we're looking at a series of plots now, and it's quite easy to get confused between them all. There's 4 plots. The first one, so you could have a question like this: explain why the revolt of the Northern Earls threatened Elizabeth. So, the plan was pretty much the same. So the reason why Catholics were upset was because they'd lost a lot of influence at the court and lots of land, and Elizabeth had appointed lots of new Protestant people, such as William Cecil. So the plan was that Mary would marry the Duke of Norfolk, who was the richest landowner in England, and as a pair, with his wealth and her legitimate claim, she would become queen. And Spain was persuaded to provide assistance to this. Now, what happened was Robert Dudley, who was close to Elizabeth, told her of the plot. Norfolk was put in prison. However, the earls in the north of Northumberland, which is up by Newcastle, and Westmoreland, took their armies and took control of Durham Cathedral and began to march south along the coast. Now, the reason why this plot failed was because very sensibly Elizabeth immediately stopped Mary Queen of Scots from escaping and put her under constant guard. Otherwise, that would encourage other people in the north to join. The Spanish help never arrived, and therefore, because of these things, most of the northern landowners, quite sensibly, refused to support the plot. Now, what was the significance of this? Well, it showed quite clearly that Mary could not be trusted. She was put in an even more secure household arrest. The Pope in Rome, because obviously she killed Catholics, excommunicated Elizabeth, which basically means that effectively Elizabeth couldn't go to heaven and all that kind of religious side of things, and this just further encouraged more Catholic plots. The government, English government, in retaliation began to take steps against Catholics, and they, on the positive side, they began to send more troops north and more Protestants north, so their control of the north was strengthened. So this was the kind of first kind of thing that happened here. The next plot is called the Ridolfi plot. Ridolfi was an Italian guy, and the background to this was there was a whole sort of series of strict laws against Catholics, where they if they could pray, where they could go to church, if they could go to church, fining them for not going to church. So because if you treat people harshly, if you treat students harshly in the class, generally, students don't really respond well to that and will probably behave even worse. So more and more Catholics began to plot against Elizabeth. So the plan was, usual story, murder Elizabeth, the Spanish would invade, Mary Queen of Scots would marry the Duke of Norfolk and become queen. And if you remember, we watched that film with a guy there who's the Duke of Norfolk. Spain promised to prepare an army of 10,000 men in the Netherlands and send them over. However, William Cecil discovered the plot, and Norfolk was sent to the Tower of London and executed for treason. Now, the question on everyone's lips was, why not execute Mary? Elizabeth probably quite wisely felt if she did that, she would anger both the French and the Spanish who would invade her. So why is this plot significant? Well, it shows that the Spanish were going to get involved actively. It made Elizabeth realise that she had to improve relationships with France because she would struggle to fight against both France and Spain. The government also began to monitor Catholics a lot closely, and there was all kinds of new laws, the infamous priest holes. And it became clear that Mary Queen of Scots was a very dangerous threat to Elizabeth. Okay, the next two plots, and I've really simplified this because they're quite similar, are called the Throckmorton plots. So basically, the plan of the Throckmorton plots is the same: invade England, etc., etc., put Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. Now, Walsingham's spies, Elizabeth's spies, discovered the letters, and Throckmorton, who was an English guy, was executed. Now, why is this significant? Because it highlighted the threat from Spain and France. Also, like the letter there, it contained hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Catholic sympathisers who potentially could take part in plots. This was much higher than Elizabeth had suspected. So in order to contain this, she passed a series of harsh laws and began to imprison Catholics. The last plot is called the Babington plot, and again, very, same plan. Invade England, Mary Queen of Scots on the throne. But the difference between this one was, for the first time, that the English spies proved that Mary was involved in a plot. So there was all these letters going backwards and forwards between them, and they managed to crack the code, as you can see on the right there. And for the first time, Mary Queen of Scots was implicated in this crime. So why was it significant? Well, by this point, Spain and England were virtually at war, and it provided the necessary evidence to execute Mary. Okay, so all of these plots signify and highlight the importance of Walsingham and his spy network. So obviously they proved or provided the intelligence. They proved the evidence of Mary's involvement in the Babington plot. How did they do this? Well, they had a huge network of spies in both England, Scotland, all over Europe, who were well funded, well trained, and they could have the money to pay informants, Catholics, to kind of, snip some of these plots in the bud. They also use ciphers, we would call that code, to make sure that their own plans were secure, and they hired experts to crack and decipher the plotter's code. They also, and Walsingham himself apparently liked doing this personally, torture and execute Catholic priests and other informants and other Catholics to try and get more information from them. And they also use something called agent provocateurs. And what that means is really any names on the list or anybody they thought could potentially start a plot, they encouraged them. So go on, let's start this plot to kill Elizabeth. Gave them money and effectively set them up as a fall guy. So it encouraged suspected plotters to plot against it, and therefore they arrested them. So that's actually quite a clever way to catch people. So the last but not least is the execution of Mary, Queen of Scots herself. Now, Elizabeth was very, very reluctant to actually sign the death warrant. In fact, lots of debate about whether she actually did. And the reason for this was it set a dangerous precedent. She was worried that potentially in future years that maybe she would be executed, and she didn't like to do that. The other reason was obviously she was a family member, her cousin, and it left Elizabeth in no possible heir. So people again began to talk about who's going to become king after or queen after she died. And in particular, as we're going to look at in our next episode, it angered the Spanish because Mary had given her claim to King Philip, and he became determined to control England and obviously the Armada. But from Elizabeth's point of view, it removed the direct threat once and for all that Mary provided. So if you want to have a go doing this question for homework, the explain why question, please have a go. Next time, I'm going to be looking at the Spanish Armada, and then we're going to be doing about Elizabethan society, and then the last one will be about exploration. So really, we've got another 3 to go. I'll try and knock out another one this week, 2 next week, and then move on to do Nazi Germany before half term.